Testing, 1, 2, 3. Hello, hello, hello.
I was like, oh, I better get in there and open it.
Hey, Amy.
Hey. Did you see the email about Anna? Yeah, it's too bad, but it'll mean there's more conversation. Nina's and your papers are actually the most closely related. So.
I did see her, Nina's paper and mine. Yeah, the titles are so similar.
Yeah, so I think that'll be a really nice conversation. All right, I'm gonna run and get one coffee at the back of it.
Okay.
Your dress and my dress match.
Oh my gosh, we coordinated.
Thank you. To the first panel of the day, the last day of the conference, it's been fantastic. I'm Susan Wegener from Purdue University. I just want to welcome everyone to this wonderful panel. I do just want to make a quick announcement that Anna Lindhe is unfortunately unable to make it today. She is sick, so we will miss her. And, that will mean that we have a lot more time for questions today. So, we're really looking forward to that. And I think one thing that I would really like to do is follow one of the suggestions for the conference and maybe leave a little bit of time between the two papers for us to regroup and ask some questions, write some stuff down, because again, we'll have so much time for questions. So, just so everyone knows that after the first paper, I'd like to just take a really short 2 to 3 minute break, and then we'll start the next paper. And, everything else we all kind of know. Please remain muted until all panelists have given the paper. This session is going to be recorded. And I think that's it for housekeeping stuff. So I will introduce each panelist right before they come on. Okay, so our first panelist today is Victoria Juarez. Victoria is a senior undergraduate student at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. Her interest in Woolf began in a class delving into Virginia Woolf's literature taught by Dr. Amy Smith in spring 2021. Victoria has been working this semester as a student assistant helping to organize this conference. Victoria will be completing her student teaching this upcoming semester and will then begin teaching high school English, working to give students a voice. And Victoria, is it okay if I just drop the link into the chat? Link to your paper?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, thanks. I'm just gonna take a second to do that. Okay, so that's there, just if anyone needs an access copy. Thanks to Victoria for providing that. And also thank you for helping to organize this conference. It's been just wonderful.
No problem. I'm so glad everyone's having a wonderful time. And before I get started, I just want to say how honored I am to be in the presence of such amazing minds and to be able to share my thoughts about Woolf here. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So my paper is entitled On the Impossibility of Knowing Other Minds, Empathy and Invasion in Woolf's Fiction and Essays. In both her fiction and essays, Woolf explores the complexities of attempting to know other minds, of bridging the gap between individuals. She often depicts characters attempting to perceive the inner thoughts of others, and she shows both the persistence of this attempt and its impossibility. This ubiquitous human desire to know, or to feel that we know, the minds of others poses important ethical problems. Attempting to know the thoughts and feelings of other people from the outside can feel like an invasion of privacy. Further, there is no way that we can perceive the true thinking of others. Our knowledge of others, our confidence that we have them all figured out, is a fantasy that can be dangerous, self-serving, and unjust. In Virginia Woolf and the Ethics of Intimacy, Elsa Holberg addresses this phenomenon in Woolf's modernist fiction, especially in Jacob's Room, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, and The Waves. Holberg continues that Woolf's critical engagement with the difficulties involved in the representation of interiority, the creation of real, true, and convincing characters whose inner lives resist knowledge and description, yet must be conveyed, drives her modernist project. Indeed, the impossible necessity of the novelist describing other minds, the minds of characters, is central to Woolf's theory of fiction, as she develops it in early essays like Characters in Fiction and Modern Fiction. In this paper, I examine Woolf's depiction of narrators or characters assuming knowledge of minds of other characters in her 1927 essay, Street Haunting, A London Adventure, an essay that Holberg does not discuss, and in her 1931 modernist masterpiece, The Waves. I am interested in a slightly different aspect of Woolf's articulation of modernist fiction than that with which Holberg opens her book. Woolf's statement at the end of modern fiction that the proper stuff of fiction does not exist. Everything is the proper stuff of fiction. Every feeling, every thought, every quality of brain and spirit is drawn upon. No perception comes amiss. As Woolf writes in the same essay for the modern writer, the point of interest lies in the dark places of psychology. Focusing on Woolf's insistence that fiction should attempt to represent every quality of brain and spirit, I argue that Woolf creates a fiction that presents people's realistic thought processes by creating characters who try and perceive what those around them think or feel. This overwhelming desire to claim knowledge of the minds of others is part of what we will find in the dark places of psychology. This effort is seen in society daily. Individuals would prefer to believe that they know exactly what another person is thinking about life in general, or about them in relation to their companions. But there is no way that we can. Woolf wants to present this kind of thinking in her fiction, as it seems to be often overlooked. Woolf decides that fictional writing needs to take a less formal approach and depict more of the true human experience. So of course she strives to create this type of fiction in her own writing. In Street Haunting, a London Adventure, Woolf both depicts and problematizes this ubiquitous human practice, complicating it in ways that foreshadow her treatment of it in The Wave, a novel which she began writing 2 years after Street Haunting was published. In this experimental essay, we have a female narrator who walks through town describing virtually everything she comes across. However, her descriptions are not just tied to inanimate objects. She also describes the people that she sees. More than that, she describes what she thinks they might feel or think, given the little that she knows by viewing them passing during her walk. The first instance in which the narrator does this is with a little person that she sees in a shoe shop. The very first thing she says upon seeing the woman is, quote, "What then is it like to be a dwarf?" Unquote. This question is problematic because nearly as soon as she sees the woman, the narrator begins to imagine what her experience of life must be, how she must feel, what she thinks, without ever speaking to the woman. There's no possible way that she can ever know what it is like to be a little person, and attempting to get into the headspace can be damaging. Let us say, for example, that she believes that it is a sad thing to be a little person, and so believes that this woman she has just met has led a sad life. This immediately changes how she would treat or view the woman, despite her knowing nothing about the woman or her true feelings about being a little person. What if it's the other way around? What if the narrator thinks it would be great fun to be a little person and expects the woman to be joyous and vibrant because of being a little person? Either of these perceptions place an unfair expectation on the woman who entered the store looking for shoes. Further, the narrator's belief about the woman center her difference from the narrator, identifying her as a quote, a dwarf, unquote, rather than a full human being with dwarfism. The narrator identifies the woman with what the narrator perceives as a disability and assumes that the woman's mental landscape is similarly occupied with this facet of her existence, the only one that counts as the real or important to the narrator. The narrator follows this initial question with a full account of the shopping done by the little person. The movement and actions of the little person are carefully recorded, and what the narrator thinks each move indicates is shared with the reader. The narrator even goes so far as to say what she believes the little person is thinking. Woolf writes, she thinks that, after all, feet are the most important part of the whole person. Women, she said to herself, have been loved for their feet alone, unquote. In this important passage, the narrator presumes to know what, quote, she was thinking, unquote. But there's no way that she can know what the woman is thinking. The implications of this assumption made by the narrator here are quite concerning. She imagines that the woman is self-conscious about her physical appearance, and that she therefore takes pride in her feet as her saving grace when it comes to being seen as lovable. Here we see the narrator's own imagination creating a thought for a woman whom she doesn't know and assuming that the only reason that someone would find her lovable was because of her feet. This is unjust to the woman who she is attempting to perceive. She is being used as a plaything in the mind of a stranger who knows nothing about her or her feelings on being a little person, nor her thoughts about her feet. At this juncture, one might ask where we draw the line between such fantastical assumptions and the lives of other people, which I am arguing is invasive and psychically violent, and empathy. There is a way in which attempting to see from the perspective of another, to enter their mental landscape, can be seen as an effort at empathy. But there is also an important difference between being empathetic towards someone that you know is suffering or is joyous based on the conversation you had with them, and invading someone's privacy by imagining a life for them without knowing anything about them. Street Haunting is an incredibly important text for understanding Woolf's sophisticated engagement with the imaginative invasion of other minds. Street Haunting is explicitly shaped around a tension between surface appearance and depth that results in a repeated pattern of the narrator speaking for us in the plural first person, falling into the temptation to see beneath the surface appearance and stopping herself because we are in danger of digging deeper than the eye approves at any moment. The sleeping army of human beings may rouse itself and assert all its oddities and sufferings and solidarities. Let us dally a little longer, be content with the surface only. And yet, despite the narrator's awareness of the dangers of digging deeper than we ought, the limitations of the eye, its inability to compose the trophies it collects into anything other than simple sugary fare, leave us wanting more. And so we make some little excuse, which has nothing to do with the real reason, for folding up the bright paraphernalia on the streets and withdrawing to some duskier chamber of being, where we might ask, quote, what then is it like to be a dwarf, unquote. About our tendency to indulge ourselves imaginatively, the narrator again chides herself. What could be more absurd? Yet she places the blame on nature, not us. It is nature's folly. When she set about her chief masterpiece, the making of man, she should have thought of one thing. Instead, into each one of us she let creep instincts and desires which are utterly at variance with his main being. These instincts and desires are what in modern fiction Woolf calls the dark places of psychology, the ubiquitous desire to know what we cannot know, the minds of others. In The Waves, Woolf extends her treatment of this tension by juxtapositioning characters, perspectives, and voices, revealing both how inaccurate characters' perceptions are of other characters and how characters feel about being misperceived by their friends. As Hobart notes, in the years of planning and writing The Waves, during which, incidentally, she was also writing Street Haunting, Woolf's diary demonstrates a heightened interest in interiority. In this novel, Woolf follows 6 characters: Bernard, Neville, Louis, Susan, Jenny, and Rhoda, from childhood through their lives, using soliloquies as the only form of obtaining the story. Because this novel is organized only using soliloquies, the only way that we can learn anything about the story is through the view of one of the 6 characters. The characters that are speaking switch often in the beginning of the book, but the soliloquies get longer as the book continues. Due to the soliloquies, the characters' minds and actions are only known as they are conducted by and presented by their companions. The perception that the characters form about one another is very interesting and extremely important to the argument. It would seem that every character is guilty of believing that they understand the inner thoughts of one or more of their companions. As this is an occurrence that happens with all of the characters, the reader must ask themselves why this choice was made on the part of the author. It stands to reason that the justification for making each character attempt to perceive the inner thoughts of others was a direct reflection of how common this practice is. No one is innocent of this practice, but everyone is responsible for the harm and bias such practices create in themselves and others. 2 of the characters we see attempting to perceive the thoughts of other characters are Bernard and Neville. There is a scene in the book where the 2 characters are taking turns sharing their soliloquies with the audience, and they each present their ideas about what the other truly feels and who he truly is. As Bernard says at the beginning of the passage provided in the handout, "Let me create you. You have done as much for me." Here we see Bernard attempting to identify his friend using assumptions that he has created about Neville's innermost thoughts. The wording that is used here is very important. Bernard uses the phrase, "let me create you," which implies that Neville does not yet exist. However, Neville does exist. In fact, exists at the same time of the soliloquy, but the version of Neville that has been created in Bernard's mind did not exist. Once again, we are reminded that Bernard is not capable of knowing what Neville thinks or feels, and yet he shares a version of Neville with the real Neville, which reveals probably more than he realizes about how he views Neville. The interesting part of this explanation of Neville is that he is right in some ways about his friend, but he is wrong in others. This partial correctness could have caused Neville to feel both exposed and misunderstood by his friend due to his attempts to fully perceive him and his thoughts. Shortly after this, Bernard feels exposed when Neville shares what he thinks of him and his obsession with being like Byron. As Bernard describes it, he, Neville, looked at me. Turning to face me, he gave me his poem. All mists curl off the roof of my being. All semblances were rolled up. You are not Byron. You are yourself, to be contracted by another person into a single being. How strange. Here we see the effects of learning the perceptions that have been created in the minds of your companions. It is clear that Bernard found the way that Neville perceived him to be devastating and harmful, but most importantly, he thought it was untrue to who he was. Bernard sees himself as multiple different people in this novel, and to be perceived by his friends as just one of these people and a made-up version of that one person on top of that was untrue to him. This is one of the major reasons why attempting this perception is not helpful or just. Bernard feels judged and hurt that Neville does not even have a correct perception of him, so it is helpful to neither party. Bernard describes Neville as like a long wave. He went over me, dragging me open, laying bare the pebbles on the shore of my soul. It was humiliating. I was turned to small stones. This is one instance of Woolf's repeated analogy that links characters' perceptions of one another with waves, and I believe this is why the book is titled The Wave. Woolf created a book that both showed the reader the innermost thoughts of the characters and their attempts at constructing the innermost thoughts of their companions, and how these constructions were never fully correct. The reader is able to see conflicting views of characters from their companions and themselves, and effects of being partially and inaccurately seen by those around one. As Hoberg writes, The Waves remains Woolf's most thorough engagement with self-formation and the formation of self-other relations. But these processes also form the basis of ethical as well as political reflection. I agree, yet I see Street Haunting as another text written while Woolf was planning The Waves, in which Woolf engages the interlaced questions of self-other relations, especially as constituted through the imaginative invasion of another's mind and one's own self-formation, as it is constructed imaginatively by our friends and enforced by our surroundings. This is evident in the opening of that essay, in which the excursion to buy a pencil offers the possibility of freedom from being quite ourselves. We shed the selves our friends know us by and become part of the vast Republican army of anonymous trampers. And one may escape objects which perpetually express the oddity of our own temperament and enforce the memories of our own experience. Walking the line of empathy and invasion is a tricky undertaking. So often in today's society, we as individuals are so sure that we know what is best, even when it comes to understanding others. However, we cannot create a false perception of the people in our minds because of our trying to understand their thinking and feeling without being morally unjust to both ourselves and the individual. Virginia Woolf has created a way to present this idea in her fiction while also letting the reader arrive at this conclusion on their own and realizing that they also participate in these destructive actions. Now that we are aware of this practice that is so easy to participate in but so unhelpful to anyone, we should strive as individuals to see people as they are, not as we construct them to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was really, really amazing. Okay, so why don't we all just take 2 to 3 minutes just to formulate questions and think about this, and then we'll start on the next paper. Okay, let's move on to the next paper, given by Nina Eldridge, entitled Knowing and Writing Other People's Minds, to the Lighthouse's Argument for Empathy. Nina Eldridge is a graduate student at the Université of Bordeaux, Montaigne in the southwest of France, where she teaches literature and translation. Her research focuses on time and space in modernist literature. Her dissertation is entitled Physics and Metaphysics of Literary Description in James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. And it looks like she has posted a link in the chat. I'll do that again just for anyone who just came in.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen because I have some quotes on a PowerPoint. Is that coming up correctly? I don't feel like it is.
The top is cut.
Sorry, the top is cut. I'm going to use my backup PDF.
That looks great, Nina. Thank you.
The top is not cut now.
Yep, that looks beautiful.
I hadn't planned to talk about any of the pictures, but they're all from East Sussex. If you want to know where any of them are exactly, we can do that afterwards. So I did rework my paper a bit, and I realized the point I'm making is perhaps not so much an argument for empathy, but maybe looking at the conditions for empathy and maybe looking at why it's a good start. So maybe because we have a bit more time today, we'll be able to find a definition together in the discussion. So I'd like to start my presentation with a quote, which, while not from To the Lighthouse, I'm sure you will all recognize. I didn't put it in, I'm so sorry. Nobody sees anyone as he is, let alone an elderly lady sitting opposite a strange young man in a railway carriage. They see a whole, they see all sorts of things, they see themselves. So this is, of course, from the beginning of chapter 3 in Jacob's room, when Jacob sits across from an old woman in a train compartment. This was a quote that was echoing through my mind during one of my readings of To the Lighthouse. And this is also one of the first Woolf quotes I came across where I could really hear her echoing Bertrand Russell's problem of other people's minds. Another such instance was from a piece of Lily Briscoe's in a monologue in To the Lighthouse. How then, she had asked herself, did one know one thing or another thing about people, sealed as they were? The idea from the Jacob's room quote of seeing ourselves when we look at someone else raises many ethical concerns, both in interacting with someone and in writing someone or writing interactions. These two situations, interacting and writing, are closely connected, and exploring one feeds into our understanding of the other. This is quite a broad topic, so I wanted to focus today on empathy and the conditions necessary for listening and understanding another person. So to do so, I'll first be looking into the problem of other people's minds in a little more depth. Then I'll look at examples of incuriosity in To the Lighthouse, and finally examples of paying attention, and how even if the conditions for empathy are met, they might actually not be sufficient. So first of all, problem of other people's minds. I'd like to establish what we mean when we talk about the problem of other people's minds. So this is a philosophical question that, of course, predates Bertrand Russell and the 20th century, but I'll be focusing on his view on it so that we can best see the relation between this problem and Woolf's writing. And so Bertrand Russell has quite an empiricist grounding. He's essentially concerned with questions of how is it that I see what I see? How is it that I know what I know? And he realized that we come to a sort of philosophical dead end when we ask these questions in regards to the knowledge of other people's minds. What goes on in the minds of others is known to us through our perceptions of their bodies, that is, through the sense data in us which are associated with their bodies. But for our acquaintance with the contents of our own minds, we should be unable to imagine the minds of others, and therefore we could never arrive at the knowledge that they have minds. Usually we would construct our knowledge from the sense data gathered during the stage of perception. But when we interact with a second subject, the problem of the origin of that sense data comes forth. We might think it silly to imagine that we could potentially only be imagining every interaction we have with someone else, imagining that they have a mind. But Bertrand Russell's issue here, as with the axioms of Euclidean geometry, is not about what fits common sense or doesn't fit it. It's more about how do we prove what we've been assuming as common sense so far? How can we logically and mathematically lay it out so that we have no doubt as to it being true? What he points to in this passage is that when we suppose other people have minds, we're only imagining they have minds because we have one. And this is called knowledge by inference, and as opposed to knowledge by acquaintance, the knowledge of sense data. We never literally come into contact with the other person's mind, only what it generates in the shared physical reality we have between us. And when we cannot grasp something directly, we have to proceed by analogy, something writers and novelists do all the time. However, knowledge by inference generates its own problems, as we can see in this second passage from Russell. To common sense, the existence of other minds does not appear open to doubt, and I do not myself see any reason to disagree with common sense on this point, but undoubtedly it is through experiences of my own that I am led to believe in the minds of others. So when we encounter an inanimate object, perhaps a leaf or a tree, for instance, and there's still going to be a degree of subjectivity in the way that we perceive it. However, because we intuitively, from the start, understand it as fundamentally different from us, we're less likely to imagine it in our image. The risk of imagining other people's minds by analogy is that, like in any analogy, the thing we compare from will colour the thing that we compare to. We reason from and out of ourselves what we know best. And so we risk a projection of obvious and easy to understand parts of ourselves that will then cover the more elusive, the more complex part of the other. We also risk exporting a framework, a certain way of seeing the world. And if we do that, we miss the knowledge that can come from other ways of seeing. This is a criticism that's often expressed in regards to empathy, current times. Empathy, which is after all a mental identification with an object of contemplation. How we treat that object, how much of ourselves we put into it, is where the ethical debate arises. There's a risk, to borrow from modern fiction, of being like Mr. Bennet and his magnificent apparatus and catching life just an inch or two on the wrong side. In any case, truly knowing someone else is a problem that demands careful attention. To the Lighthouse shows us the power of noticing and the pain from what, borrowing from Richard Rorty, I'll be calling incuriosity. So starting with a lack of curiosity, a lack of seeing others, we have into the Lighthouse, Lily Briscoe's thoughts on Mr. Ramsay. What she disliked was his narrowness, his blindness, she said, looking after him. Lily Briscoe went on putting away her brushes, looking up, looking down. Looking up, there he was, Mr. Ramsay, advancing towards them, swinging, careless, oblivious, remote. A bit of a hypocrite, she repeated. Oh no, the most sincere of men, the truest, here he was. The best, but, looking down, she thought, he is absorbed in himself, he is tyrannical, he is unjust, and kept looking down, purposely, for only so could she keep steady, staying with the Ramsays. Mr. Ramsay, being blind and Oblivious shows him as unseeing, and he certainly does not see the effect he's having in this passage. With Lily Briscoe looking down, the reader can tell that despite her attempt to give a balanced view, she is uncomfortable in Mr. Ramsay's presence. And then, of course, later on, she doesn't want him coming to look at her painting. In regards to Nabokov's writing on cruelty, Richard Rorty points out the following. We are more likely to notice the joys or the sufferings of one person if our attention is directed to it by the surprising indifference of another person. The dynamic between Mr. Ramsay and Lily Briscoe indeed encourages identification with the latter, and the narrative techniques employed also play into Suzanne Keen's concept of narrative empathy. And a note on sympathy, just because there are so many passages where Mr. Ramsay demands it. The term empathy had barely entered the English language when To the Lighthouse was written. So some uses of sympathy might be empathy in today's language. And this sympathy-empathy problem is definitely true for David Hume, who wrote on sympathy and who Mr. Ramsay mentions a few times. Another example of incuriosity comes from Mrs. Ramsay thinking about Charles Tansley at the dinner table. For that was his criticism of poor Sir Walter, or perhaps it was Jane Austen, amounted to. I. He was thinking of himself and the impression he was making, as she could tell by the sound of his voice and his emphasis and his uneasiness. Success would be good for him. And I'd like to connect this attitude described here with how Richard Rorty develops his concept of incuriosity. So Kimboat and Humbert are both Nabokov characters. Both Kimboat and Humbert are exquisitely sensitive to everything which affects or provides expression for their own obsession, and entirely incurious about anything that affects anything else. These characters dramatize, as it has never before been dramatized, the particular form of cruelty about which Nabokov worried most, incuriosity. Of course, Charles Tansley's blunders are really a far cry from the cruelty of Nabokov's characters, but what he does have in common with them is combining gifted intelligence with a lack of interest in others. His gifts are focused in one particular direction, his dissertation, his desire to construct a certain image of himself, to be a certain someone. And this is at the cost of being able to establish an actual connection in the conversation. So no closeness means no contact, means no connection. The problem of other people's minds doesn't even occur to him, as when the other is but an audience, their individual specificity does not come into account at all. So if incuriosity isolates, then perhaps the path to empathy can be found in curiosity and in paying attention, and that's what I'd like to look at now. So an example where we see paying attention as bringing a shift in perspective is Lily Briscoe's and Mrs. Ramsay's thoughts on Charles Tansley and the way these evolve. So first, Mrs. Ramsay. She liked Charles Tansley, she thought, suddenly. She liked his laugh. She liked him for being so angry with Paul and Minter. She liked his awkwardness. There was a lot in that young man after all. And I think the two simple words at the end here, after all, give so much more richness and texture to this passage. It's not just about a sudden change in perspective. It's a change that clicks into sudden effect after a process. Liking him comes from having seen him interact with others, having experienced his existence for long enough, being familiar with him. Because she knows how to pay attention, Mrs. Ramsay is able to see what she did not see at first and establish a more complex view of Charles Tansley. Lily Briscoe also goes through a similar process. Everything about him had that meagre fixity, that bare unloveliness, but nevertheless, the fact remained. It was impossible to dislike anyone if one looked at them. She liked his eyes. They were blue, deep set, threatening. Lily's appreciation of Charles Tansley is more distant and aesthetic than Mrs. Ramsay's. And I think this can perhaps be chalked up to their differences in temperament. Mrs. Ramsay, more concerned with social interactions, notices Charles Tansley in social interactions, whereas Lily Briscoe, more concerned with the visual realm, notices physical features. And so we do have a bit of nuance here. Even in their paying attention and their noticing, what they notice is still very much influenced by who they are. So properly interacting with the other and not seeing them through a framework that we project demands really a high degree of ethical effort, and perhaps recognizing the other's mind as something almost sacred or a sanctuary. For instance, Lily Briscoe, in regards to Mrs. Ramsay's mind, but into what sanctuary had one penetrated? She asks this question during an insistent observation of Mrs. Ramsay. She then further imagines the inside of Mrs. Ramsay's mind. She imagined how in the chambers of the mind and heart of the woman who was physically touching her was stood, like the treasures in the tombs of kings, tablets bearing sacred inscriptions, which if one could spell them out, would teach one everything, but they would never be offered openly, never made public. This imagery helps assert the public-private distinction in regards to the mind. But the phrase treasures in the tombs of kings does show that the secrets of the mind are, first of all, sought after, and second, at risk of being pillaged. And in pillaging or grave robbing, we have a purely materialist point of view with no notion of a spiritual meaning in the boundaries that are traced and that are then crossed and disrespected. However, Woolf adds that these things would never be offered openly, adding an extra dimension to the mind. There is a difference between a treasure that is taken and one that is voluntarily given. Mere possession is not enough. It is the conditions of acquisition that change the knowledge we have in the end. This is a difference that Martha Nussbaum also points out in her article on To the Lighthouse. We can conceive of a knowledge that does not entail possession, that acknowledges, in fact, the impossibility of possession as a central fact about the lives of persons. Acknowledging the impossibility of possessing other people's minds stems from an acceptance of the impossibility of engaging with them via knowledge by acquaintance, the knowledge of sense data. Knowledge by inference, analogy knowledge, may have its frustrating and unsatisfying limitations, but the answer is not to take the mind of the other and twist it to fit a methodology for a knowledge acquisition that is not appropriate for it. We harm the other and we rob ourselves of a true voluntary connection. So to briefly conclude, I'd just like to say that paying attention is definitely preferable to incuriosity when considering the problem of other people's minds, but it's not free from ethical problems. When we look at the different ways of paying attention, this is also where we can see the difference between sympathy and empathy. The difference between the M and sim prefixes allows us to unpack the etymologies of the two words. Sympathy could be paraphrased as, my feelings are with you, whereas empathy would be closer to, your feelings are inside me. And we can understand the difference in effect and interaction, that the results that will come from it, by paying attention to the movement and the direction of the flow of emotion and feeling. More broadly, however, accepting the limits of our knowledge goes beyond the problem of other people's minds, and it is essential in any quest for knowledge that we undertake. So I'd just like to finish off with a quote from Bertrand Russell on this. Unless we can know something without knowing everything, it is obvious that we can never know something. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nina. So we still have a good amount of time. So let's take another 2 to 3 minute break just to finalize our thoughts, and then we'll come back and ask some questions together. Okay, so let's get back together here and start asking some questions. Okay, so Amy is copying, so there's a lot of questions here in the chat. Amy's copying them all down and will give them to me, but I'll start just from the top, from the questions that I can see here. So Stacy Hubbard asks a question of Victoria. So she says, thank you for a very thought-provoking paper, Victoria. I wonder about your final comment that we should, quote, see people as they are, not as we construct them to be, end quote. In the waves, people do seem constructed out of their social relations as part of an ensemble. Do you see the characters having identities that are separate from these relations? If so, how might the other characters or we as readers get at those identities?
Thank you so much for your question, Stacy. Yes, I absolutely do think that they have more to their characters than what their cohorts perceive. It's really, I think, in this book, so well constructed that they're written in soliloquies, so you can kind of peek behind the curtain, as it were, in a way that, you know, we're not usually able to do in books. So to me, it was very interesting that we got to see the characters and all the characters' thoughts. For example, like Bernard thought 3,000 different things a day and believed himself to be so many different kind of people, even within himself. And but, you know, in the way that they act in front of each other, not every thought that they have is being presented and reflected in their actions, just as with us. And so in that sense, identity is within oneself, but only our outer actions are perceived, the characters' outer actions are perceived. And so, like, I think it's interesting because we as readers get to see a lot more than the rest of the characters do. So I think the way that Woolf wrote the waves, we get to see most of the character of each of the individuals, whereas their counterparts only could see the surface level. I'm sorry, does that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you heard Ben's paper the other day about soliloquy, but that was resonating for me as you were talking about this. I mean, one of the things that interests me so much in the waves is the parts of the characters' lives that we never hear anything about.
Right.
I mean, they are offering soliloquies, but their soliloquies are mostly about how they feel about the other 5 characters. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
internal thoughts, but they're internal thoughts about social relations. And there's like whole parts of their lives, like marriages and children and things that we really never even hear about. And so it's that ensemble quality to me, which maybe kind of goes back to some of what was being just what I think Ben was raising about the play-like quality of the novel. But yeah, I mean, I find you're reading your idea of the invasiveness of empathy, I think is really fruitful. And I really find that really helpful. And it, for me, then Nina's paper kind of brings up the question of how the observer is their own character is reflected in how they imagine other people's interiors. And so I thought that those 2 papers were talking to each other in an interesting way. Like in Street Haunting, I kept thinking, what aspect of the narrator's character is reflected in her understanding of the little person? Like, is she a shoe fetishist herself? I mean, do men admire her feet? You know, it's like, what's she bringing to the claims that she's making there? And I thought Nina's paper kind of, in a way, really talked with yours in such a fruitful way. So thank you so much. These were just wonderful papers to hear together. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so it looks like the next question is from Ana Carolina Acevedo Guedes. She says, beautiful presentation, Victoria. I wonder if part of this ethical construction and deconstruction that Woolf proposes is part of a theorization of the role of the reader, seen perhaps as a thinker of the text as well?
Thank you so much for your question, Anna. I think it has a lot to do with the reader, particularly in the street haunting and the waves. And I think that we're kind of meant to question our own thoughts about the readings as we're reading them. And, you know, as a reader, you're kind of getting a story handed to you. And so it's interesting the way that different people perceive these stories. And it definitely highlights, I think that as a reader, what you're interested in is what you will find in the text that you read. So I think in the waves, I heard so many papers about the waves over the past 4 days, so many amazing papers, things I would never, ever have thought of, just glaring people in the faces. And I think that, you know, the part of the reader in reading text is what you bring to them. And so that's, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of how I thought about the reading.
Yes, Victoria, thank you. And
Thank you.
again, beautiful presentation.
Thank you so much.
Can I just add on to that? That is a really interesting point, and the ways I think a lot about the ways that our readings, our reading practices of books are related to our reading practices of other people, right? Which Nina and Tori, your papers bring out. And I agree completely. I have the same experience, Tori, where I think a lot of us agree with you that we are bringing so much to the text. And then it's really interesting to think about what are the ethics of reading. We had that really interesting panel about ethics of reading yesterday, I think, and the ways that those two things connect. Tori, you know, I'm working with you on this paper for a long time, so you know I love this paper. And Nina, I loved your paper too. I'm so glad these papers were in conversation with each other. I was so happy when we received both of these abstracts and we could create this conversation. And I just, I was thinking you were hoping, Nina, that we might work towards a definition of empathy, which I think could be a really interesting thing for us to work through, because Tori is really kind of emphasizing some of the negative potential of that attempt to bridge the gap between self and other. And then Nina, your paper so beautifully talked about both sides of this, and still the necessity of trying to do that. I loved the way that you brought Bertrand Russell in. I was so happy to see that. And also Martha Nussbaum. And sorry, I'm kind of meandering here, Nina, but so for a long time, I've part of my other author, right? My other author is Iris Murdoch, and I'm getting, I published on her, it's particularly her moral philosophy, which I think, Nina, you would get so much out of. I think I'll hold up the book for you in a minute. Existentialists and Mystics would be the book I would recommend for you. Nussbaum's theory is heavily influenced by Murdoch, and Nussbaum doesn't always, lots of people's moral theories are heavily influenced by Murdoch. Here's my hobby horse. People don't often acknowledge that. Like, I think she's kind of a kind of invisible mother in philosophy. And so those ideas, especially your language of paying attention, was so beautiful to me. And Murdoch really, in a very sustained way over many, many articles and books, develops a theory of attention as a kind of Platonic virtue. She's doing a type of Platonic virtue ethics that's all about a sort of gaze at the other. And so I really enjoyed and appreciated the way that you came at that question from a different angle, with different resources. It was really wonderful. That's not exactly a question, I guess. It's just, I mean, it's just an appreciation, Nina, and wondering if we might be interested in trying to theorize together what you proposed at the beginning, this sort of definition of empathy. I'll stop talking now.
No, thank you so much. I mean, I'm writing my PhD. All these, like, I was just furiously writing down what you were saying. Like, oh yes, that's something I have to. So no, that's.
I'll email you, Nina.
Thank you, please. And I think on what I was saying on the definition of empathy, you know, it's one of those things. When you actually sit down and pay attention to it, you go, oh, wait a minute, actually, I don't know what this means, and that's also a bit of that's always a bit of a terrifying moment if it's, you know, for a paper or an article, because you think, oh wow, I'm not qualified to do this. I'm not going to be able to write something clever on this. But it's also a good sign because I mean, I imagine like the type of people who are here, we tend to be interested in what we don't understand, and if we did understand things, they wouldn't be our research topics.
Yeah, no, Nina, you should be really proud of yourself. You've made a real contribution, an original contribution. Very much appreciated.
Tell that to my shaking hands, but
hands, get with the game.
Okay, so we have a question from Jane DeGay saying, fascinating paper, Nina. I wonder if you could say something about Mrs. Ramsey's role in the scene you've just discussed. Does she show a lack of empathy by insisting that Lily should get married?
So I was thinking about what is it? It's the bill for the greenhouse, I think, that comes up a few times in Mrs. Ramsey's psyche, often in parentheses. And I was thinking that it's almost like an intrusive thought, that she's thinking about more deeper abstract things. And we have this, the bill for the greenhouse that keeps popping up. And the question of marriage, it would be too simplified to call it an intrusive thought, but I think there's almost something reflexive with the way Mrs. Ramsey speaks of marriage, that it's something that has to be done, it must be done. And I think the novel is really showing us how it's an impulse as something of the culture that works through her, that there is a genuine concern that, given the person she is in the context she's in, for a woman, the best strategy is likely to be married, to have security, etc. And if someone isn't like Lily Briscoe, doesn't have a passion and drive, then the most secure option to have social standing and the existence in the tribe, if we get really primitive about it, is to be married. So there's this sort of survival instinct almost. And I think the fact that that we do have these long, abstract, meandering thoughts, and this sudden intrusion almost of people must get married. I think before it's a lack of empathy, it's maybe the result is a lack of empathy from a lack of conscious understanding, which is often the origin of a lack of empathy. But yeah, I've been sort of thinking about it as not quite an intrusive thought, but a compulsion.
Yeah, thank you. And I see that Rita also asked a question about this. Do you want to add to that, Rita, or was your question answered? Okay. Okay, here's a question from Christina Georgieva. Hello, Victoria. I enjoyed your paper, even though I did not attend the beginning of it. My question for you is, do you have examples in The Waves where one character misinterprets and misconceives the mind of another? Thanks.
Thank you for your question, Christina. I think, honestly, it's pretty rampant in The Waves, this ability to view a character misconceiving one another. But one that comes to mind immediately is kind of how Lewis thinks of himself as like, so he thinks of himself in the beginning of the book as at a lower scale to his counterparts because of being from a different kind of family, a different family, just a family of his father was a working man. I believe he's Australian. And so we see, I think it's Bernard, possibly Neville, seeing him as pretentious in some ways, the way that he operates and like thinking too much. When we get the view of Lewis, we see that in his mind, he is just trying to make up for the fact that he feels like he doesn't belong there at any given point, and he's trying to, you know, work to be on the same level as what he thinks his counterparts are on, his companions are on. And so I think we can also see that in Rhoda and Susan's perception of Jenny. You know, in Jenny's mind, she is a girly girl, and like, but she's just trying to live her life and, you know, get her experiences in, and she thinks of herself so highly, in positive ways in her own mind most of the time. And then we see Rhoda and Susan kind of being like, oh my God, she's such a snob. She is so not so entitled. And, you know, I think that the inner thoughts of most of these characters show that they view themselves almost as entirely different than how they're perceived by their counterparts. So that's my response. But I'm sure that there's more examples. So thank you so much for your question.
Thanks, Victoria. Rachel, you have your hand raised. Do you want to go next?
That'd be all right just to jump in because I think it might follow on. Thank you. Two really interesting papers. Victoria, I'm just wondering, what do you make of the fact that at the end we're left with just Bernard and his view, and then when he suddenly starts saying, oh, maybe I'm all of these characters, you know, and suddenly we kind of have to think, well, hang on a minute, were there 6 or are there 1? You know, what's going on there? How do you read that in relation to these really interesting ideas? Thank you.
That is such a great question. So I think that's what kind of the dwindling of the characters down to just being Bernard, and then him kind of commenting on, in the passage that I quoted in my paper, on how he views himself as so many different characters, and then is perceived as Neville as being just one of these characters, draws into question some really interesting, like, was it just Bernard? Was he just all of these characters? Even if so, that's very interesting that he would misrepresent his own mind in so different ways. Yeah, that's very interesting. But I think it could also have been that it wasn't just Bernard, that it was the group of them, and then we stopped having access to the thoughts of others as they either decided to stop sharing them or eventually like died off in some way. So I think Bernard could possibly be all of the characters, and then if he is, it would be amazing that he'd be able to see himself from an outside perspective when he is one character or another. But I think if he is all of these characters, that would be even a more of a commentary on how we have the inability to see into the mind of another if you are even one of the others and you can't see the full perception of them. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may as well, I think this end with Bernard is also can also be interpreted as a way of telling us to distrust the novelist, that even the novelist can't actually write into other people's minds, because he postures a little bit as like, I'm finally the writer. And as the reader, we were disinclined to trust him because we know this is only the end of the novel, and we've been working with an understanding that these are 6 different minds or something. And so if one suddenly does, he postures as a novelist in a context that's set up to make us disbelieve him. So maybe there's a lesson there. And something that I'm sorry, I can't pinpoint this down exactly, but for a while in French criticism, before things sort of got internationalized, the consensus, with heavy quotes here, was that the characters were 6 facets of the same mind. That I don't know where that interpretation came from, but I remember one of my older colleagues mentioning that.
That's so interesting.
We could also ask who's narrating the interludes, I guess, too. So yeah.
Yeah, Jane.
Yeah, just a tiny thing that I think Leonard actually suggested that Woolf early on suggested that they were all aspects of Virginia Woolf's character. So I think that's what, when you say what the origin of that particular interpretation, I think it probably did come from what was probably just a passing comment by Leonard, and then people have built on that to say, oh, they are perhaps 6 dimensions of the same character.
That is fascinating.
Shiloh has written a question in the chat. Can I read it aloud? Would that be good? A question for both, I hope. What an interesting use by Woolf of contracted, to be contracted by another person, has a really interesting Shakespearean resonance also. From the first sonnet, contracted to thine own bright eyes, as a kind of pure self-interest or self-love. And I wonder if there is a way that you could lean into the multiple meanings of contract here to think through empathy/ethics, or what one owes the other. And maybe even opening up onto juridical, not sure that's the right characterization, of self and self-possession and possession by others that Nina addresses. That's like a complex, nuanced question.
Juridical notions of the self. Sorry, I haven't had enough coffee this morning yet.
Could you explain a little, Shiloh, what you mean by juridical notions of the self?
Yeah, so well, I'll try, because I wasn't sure it was the right term, but I think that's sort of the right to self-determination, the right to determine oneself, which seems to be kind of at stake in your paper, Tori, but the right to not be determined by another, the right to determine oneself, self-ownership, that
kind
sort of thing.
Liberal individualism.
Yes, right. And then sort of like that also extends to kind of, it has a sort of political and a legislative balance as well, right? Which is where, how that gets reflected, enacted or not enacted or challenged in the world. And it has its roots in this sort of what is our, that juridical notion of the self, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting angle, because it touches to what's the consensus on how we interact with each other, especially when we initiate contact. Because if we don't conceive of people as sovereign individuals, if we think of in history serfdom, etc., then the belonging to the serf class and the belonging to the aristocracy, that was what determined how one should be spoken to and addressed. And if we assume that we're all equal sovereign individuals, that means we're not looking to exterior markers for how we should behave with others, but we're deciding that we recognize there's something sacred inside each one.
And if I could follow up on that for Tori, I don't know if you have any thoughts about it, but I was really struck by how you pulled that out of the waves. And all of a sudden I was sort of looking at contract and contract and thinking about that relationship. And I think if you lean into that in your paper, your analysis might
yeah, that's really
interesting. Contract theory, baby.
Professor Smith is excited.
Ben and Madeline, I don't know who first. Go ahead, Madeline.
Hey, this is lovely. I really, really enjoy it. 2 things. One, an observation that, Woolf was listening through. If we remember Gillian Beer's work on the waves, she was listening to physics where, a particle and a wave are the same thing. It just depends on how you look at them, right? And so we can also think about, the idea of sovereign individuality and interdependence as something that's in a kind of motion, right, in a relation rather than one thing or the other. And so that just struck me as maybe something useful there. But also I was really interested in the connection between understanding and empathy, because empathy, Victoria, the idea that empathy can be really invasive is I think, really on target. And so maybe just admitting that we can never fully know what another person is feeling, but that doesn't mean we can't understand them or try to understand them, right? Because sometimes saying I can never really know what it's like to be that person, it becomes an excuse for not trying. And that's part of the frustration sometimes of trying to get folks from dominantly situated, social locations to try to at least understand folks who are not, and who are in not dominant social locations. And it's just really frustrating. And maybe understanding can be a bridge between the feeling part of empathy, and then something ethical. That's just a big random nest of ideas that I'm throwing on the table here for you. And I loved your papers, all of them. They were beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that, Madeline. I think that being empathetic towards others has to, at least in some context, involve their own voice in how you're viewing them. So I think it's a slippery slope, because I think that you can be super self-serving in how you choose to view others as well. And so, like what you're saying about attempting to understand what they're presenting to you, instead of kind of running away with your own imagination and letting yourself attempt to perceive them based on your desires, is really interesting. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I just want to follow that up really quickly, Ben. Tori, we also see this in the way that Woolf thinks about writing. So like in I think even maybe in something like an unwritten novel, or the various ways that Woolf writes about writing about others, you see that consideration that you just mentioned about that running away with, which is awesome. Anyway, that's all.
Thank you.
Ben, would you like to? Sorry, Susan, I'm just a chat moderator.
Well, actually, wait, I'll let Susan call on me.
Ben?
Thank you, Susan and Amy. I really deeply appreciate. I meant what I wrote in the chat, that both of you have provided me with a conceptual context that I think I've been looking for a few years, to try to make sense of some things that I've both found interesting and disquieting in certain moments in Woolf's writing. I just want to draw attention to a diary entry, which I think Woolfians have largely tried to avoid, May 17th, 1925, where it begins quite beautifully with Woolf recounting journeying with Leonard to a church where he was giving a public lecture, not a sermon, a public lecture, and she was quite moved by the experience and has a sort of moment of being, about the interconnection of all people, and we're all one and have the same emotions and all this kind of stuff. And then she recounts the trip home, pointing out the various landmarks. And almost near the very end of the diary entry, she sees a black man in a top hat in a suit. And her immediate thought is somewhat like the thoughts you were worried about, Victoria, in the street haunting essay, an assumption of degradation stamped on him. So at once she shows a sort of ethical interest in him, paying attention, she's curious, but she also brings with it an assumption that his life must be a certain way. And I had never thought about this within a context of sympathy or empathy, and particularly the social and political valences and contingencies that are there when Woolf is trying to think about non-white people, whether they're in front of her or whether she's imagining them in other places. And so I really, really appreciate that. And you've also helped me then think about a way in which we can connect up some of these studies with, discourse about the refusal of sympathy or a politics of refusal that we see in both Black studies, but also in Indigenous studies, right? A refusal to play the game of recognition or politics, or when empathy, or where the project of empathy is precisely what one wants to be protected from, right? In some cases. And so, again, sorry, this is a bit of a, this is more a comment really, but it's really meant to be a thank you to both of you for helping me see that there is a conceptual context where I can actually start maybe piecing some of these things together, because I was really stuck and didn't know where to go, really. Aside from just being disturbed by that diary entry, I really didn't know where to situate it or how to think about it. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much. And I think I still have the translation workshop from yesterday in mind, that when we realize that we have habits for how reality comes to us, and that if we're not aware of those habits, we can't do anything. So it does come back to this question of, as I was saying in the chat earlier, almost a prerequisite of knowing oneself, and maybe that's the ethical step to take, to first know ourselves before we step out and interact with others, because otherwise we don't know what we're bringing to that interaction, and we won't recognize the parts of ourselves that manifest.
Yes.
That's so good,
Yes.
Nina.
Is it okay if I just quickly add to kind of along the lines of what Ben was saying? Victoria, so I always read that scene with the dwarf as really ableist. And, I was just wondering, so when you started talking about this, it made me think, okay, there's a lot more complexity here than I had thought about. And so, I mean, do you think that there's anything in the description and the language that the narrator is using there to suggest some kind of identification? Or do you think it's completely what you were talking about, this kind of harmful voyeurism that does harm? Like, yeah, again, just do you think that there is any suggestion that the narrator, and maybe Woolf, is thinking, I guess I would just say Woolf is thinking about the harm that is done to disabled people in particular?
I think that in that moment, I personally, when I'm reading it, I don't get a sense of trying to empathize with the little person. More, to me, it more felt like a game in the mind of like, what would I feel like? How would I go about my life? So I didn't see in that moment that she was commenting on how people view others who have dwarfism, more so as kind of just running away with, well, throughout the entire essay, she's commenting on people's lives. We see later she sees a building and she's imagining a couple in it who's standing outside the building, and it's just, it just kind of unravels as she lets herself kind of play a game with people, the innermost beings. And so I think that and in this story, the narrator sees the person with dwarfism as kind of a an oddity that's easy to imagine scenarios with because of the differences that they have. So does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, thank you. The way that you put it is a kind of a game. I completely agree with that. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stacy, you have your hand raised.
Oh, thank you. I may be misremembering this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it in Auerbach's The Brown Stocking where he talks about the very strange fact that as a novelist, Woolf could give us a complete access to the thoughts of her characters, but she actually doesn't? Like, she includes in her depiction of people's thinking like sort of pockets of unknowability where she suggests, well, maybe she thought this, maybe, and you think, why is she doing that? She's the novelist, she created them, she could know everything, but she doesn't. And I'm thinking about this as in some way, maybe just a complication of this issue of empathy and, you know, the imagining of the entrance into other minds, which should be, you know, absolutely possible for the novelist who's creating these people, as opposed to us as ordinary folks who can't do that. So there's the characters in the book that try to understand one another and perhaps fail. And then there's the novelist herself kind of enacting aspects of that failure at key moments. And that was making me think about Gretchen's plenary the other day, where she really talks about the interesting way that Woolf will often sort of expose and probe her own limitations, you know, particularly with regards to things like racial empathy or class empathy. So I'm not really sure where I would go with that, but I just maybe want to kind of throw that in as a little wrinkle here in thinking about the way that she's examining the kind of limitations of understanding or empathy, and then also maybe enacting that at the same time in her own approach to being a narrator. And, you know, I mean, one of the things we haven't really said about Bernard in The Waves is that he's so often mocked in that book. I mean, he's a ridiculous figure. You know, he's ridiculous. You know, he's self-important, and he's, you know, he's bombastic, and he misunderstands all kinds of things and takes all kinds of authority to narrate other people's stories. So, I mean, that's one of those self-mocking moments on Woolf's part too, to say, look, this is what writers do. And it's potentially wrong, it's potentially ridiculous, it's overreaching in all kinds of ways about our relationships to other people. So maybe I just want to kind of throw Woolf herself into the mix here as somebody who's involved in this very problem of not being able to understand other people. And I don't know, is that Auerbach? Am I remembering that correctly?
I think it's ringing a bell for me.
I think it is, but it's just
if you're wrong, we're wrong together in our memories.
Okay.
But I think what you're saying on representation definitely comes to what Victoria was saying about the desire for representing a realistic thought process. And as you're saying that, Victoria, I was thinking, well, that depends on Woolf's opinion of what a realistic thought process is, and it's maybe by studying that we can answer that question. And I think those pockets, those gaps, I do interpret them myself as being there voluntarily, that's the most realistic way of representing. Because also I work on Joyce as well, who's like, nope, let's open everything up. So maybe that's why I'm sensitive to that difference.
Yeah, I definitely agree. When I was writing this paper, all the time, what was going through my mind was like, Woolf wasn't willing to not put in complexities of the mind. She wasn't willing to be like, well, this is ethically questionable, so I'm just gonna toss it. She's like, well, it's ethically questionable, possibly, but I do it. I'm assuming other people do it, but I don't know if they do it. I'm gonna just put it in. And so I think that that's really powerful, because I think that it's kind of like highlighting the dark parts of the psyche, like I was talking about, that we probably don't want to think about and don't want to talk about. And so I think that it definitely could be a reflection of how Woolf thinks about people herself, for sure. Thank you, Stacey. And Nina, that was lovely.
Jeannie, do you want to add to that? Do you have a different?
Hi, first, this was so great. Thank you so much. I'm kind of can't get animal studies out of my head these days. This is what I continue to work on. And I'm thinking about Diana Royer's paper on sympathy and empathy toward animals. And as everyone was talking, I was thinking that one of the ways that Woolf tends to try to cross the species divide is through their suffering. And I know that in animal studies, there's a great resistance to only kind of seeing animals in terms of suffering beings. And so then this makes me want to kind of revisit those passages in Woolf. But another thing she tries to do with animals is very Heideggerian. She tries to kind of recreate their worlds. And yeah, I think that, you know, one of the ways she gets criticized, and Victoria, I just so love your paper, is that you almost feel like they're a springboard for her to indulge in these flights of fancy. On the other hand, when you look at Flush, she really gets it. I mean, she really gets, say, the sense of smell, and critics have written so beautifully on that. But I also love the pairing of your papers together, because at least she's trying and at least she's paying attention. But anyway, I just want to thank you both for, you know, giving me other ways of kind of thinking about her and animal studies. And I also really love the discussion too. So.
Thank you so much.
Sorry to interrupt. It's 10:30. I just wanted to let everyone know if you need to leave immediately, please do. But I'm happy to stick around if other people have questions. I think I might have missed some of the questions in the chat. So, you know, if you need to, fine. If you want to stay, please do.
I just wanted to ask, because I saw, sorry, did you say out of the corner of my eye in English? Someone earlier who said they worked on physics as well, and I don't know, I just didn't see it, who it was, but if they're still around and they want to get in touch, please do. I'd love to talk. I don't know who you are, but please.
That was Rachel Crossland. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I'll put my email address in the chat for you, Nina.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so thanks again, everyone. Thank you so much to Victoria and Nina. Like Ben said, I too have so much to think about with both of your papers. So thank you again, and hope to see the rest of you at the more sessions today.
Thank you.
Thank you, that was wonderful.
Good job,